Is everyone all set? Anyone want 30 more seconds in front?
You're not dressed as last time.
Don't worry, we don't need it.
Well, the Kingdom of Hyrule is not threatened right now.
That's okay.
We're between games.
Did you hear that there's going to be a female link in the new
Yes,
Hyrule Warriors?
New Hyrule Warriors, yeah.
I'm stoked.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Sucks to
I
be
feel
you,
kind of lame.
Emily.
I feel kind of lame.
Now you have the
actually.
K they're reading.
Maybe the only K Tom would vote on.
Alright. What's up? Great.
Advantage one is China, 18 military provinces, years from isolation war, China scaling back damage had to swing, and 15 the notion of the province constitutes the only basis for possibilities, increasing the absolute concept of efforts to sustain the absolute superiority will. Here take examples in the arms race, the U.S. efforts to sustain the superiority will, strongly choose worse fears about. He has about containment, the locking and launching vulnerability, warriors, 2% strength, ensure defense, and resisting the U.S. province would become a map with little survival limits, American province, time that China will grow into the next hegemon, while China's capabilities will grow the not front on the biggest sword again, China's attempt to establish province will almost simply feel the translation of the scaling province and American actions were defensive with the middle level security, they would take which requirements we could. Emerge Washington system maintaining its superiority and to sustain predominance will almost intensifies the security competition and greatly unsettles U.S. allies. Other strategies fail. Status quo SBF offensive strategy locks in escalation. We don't have the capability or the budget even if funding is increased weight. And 15 doctors could feel something that would make first maybe that would make meaningless the efforts to establish security assurance in a robust China that would respond to the military aspects of this would by developing code and necessary countermeasures through this robot. This robust approach would also have power harder than this approach who would rationalize the march of approach quite probable that the U.S. and Japan would lack the resources and the powerful and ambitious approach even if the funding would be available probably available problems for your economic integration could prevent the effective force structure in the absence of provocation. Tokyo is unlikely to make the commitments and push the major policy change required for the robust approach to best constraints to keep Japanese focus and see variance or even under urgency doubts could persist regarding muscular military doctrine even as design could prove this could prove an ineffective deterrent passive defense would be guaranteed safety against sophisticated missiles even under high capacity trajectory. The likely means to carry out deep strikes based escalation far more problematic than strikes but also would compress the time available to decision makers. They would be hard to limit the nuclear threshold. War goes nuclear, increases in power parity, increases stability. Goal 13 there's a relation to the region. Washington will find the region. Washington will find the first and the question that will isolate the danger. It's tangible near term and the risk might be increasing. Washington may should avoid the short that's lack of escalation should not bring complacency. The pivot signal Washington is prepared to involve U.S. insists the law for the freedom of navigation cause confrontation stand to bring possible trigger China and U.S. and get to reach understanding of vital interest or develop has management and executed by red light could increase the chances that either side can take steps that turn out to be provocative. The balance of nuclear powers lobs out a use advantage conventional sources would increase the temptation to actually use force. Beijing might feel pressure to use force before they destroy the U.S. China or the U.S. would believe that valuable would take more and would be willing to tolerate risk for using conventional forces will only be the first step in misperception and miscalculation. There's no guarantee that we should prevent from nuclear catastrophe because these computer systems that guide weapons are vulnerable. Precise weapons have been effective only if they were used before an adversary struck both with the incentive to initiate current strategy makes deterrence failure inevitable. Current and 14 even with resources that could advantage may be difficult to overcome. The HP seems to have risks of escalation to the high level of nuclear exchange. Objectives may only exacerbate mistrust and reinforce fears with China war certainty. ASP is having provocative arms race instantly may contributing to increase fears making it difficult to turn in the future. There happens to be promising components not only prohibitively costly but technologically unachievable but also highly provocative. Nuclear exchange is a real risk to the path towards the first attacks of Chinese nuclear deterrent leadership and interrupt this attack on China's ability to de-escalate. Second, China's leadership determined it was facing defeat. China might use nuclear weapons as selfish facing into the conflict. Final is the leadership would further the U.S. warnings include a regime change fearing for survival. Nuclear weapons may be used to target bases and the U.S. homeland. If the stakes are all or nothing, then there may be a little cost for strength. The U.S. may be targeting the capacity to keep a conflict limited to avoid the use of tools and would be ineffective with a completely resource response. The fear of punishment may fail. Beijing clearly views Taiwan as essential. More expansive deployment would reinforce its power facility and mistrust plan. Engenders a strategy shift that solves the security dilemma. Sweden down 13. The two nations curse about disease results in distrust and the endurance zero-sum mindset. The universal report diplomacy of the institutions likely proven adequate to avoid the worst aspects of rivalry. Beijing and Washington must understand the underlying reason for their suspicion. The two sets of security imperatives are at odds. The most important locusts in the water trying to Japan defense and also will shift away from the efforts to sustain military advantages and freedom of action via offensive strategies. It would seek to establish more dynamic power through more defensive neutral denial, post posture, tactical aircraft, and large naval air circumstances would be pulled back to locations in Guam, Hawaii, and the continental U.S. Sustaining primacy assumes stability can only be assured by negating China's capabilities through a westward presence and likely to intensify the arms race and escalation. The force of China's mainland race questions on this new capability to offshore people would prove heavily provocative, representing the incarceration of fears and circumventing defensive outside threats of both attractive access for security interests and regional stability posture centered on neutral denial and improved currency capability, moving the most vulnerable assets outside of Chinese asymmetric capabilities in the more survivable posture to better enable the U.S. to ensure security and deterring personal discretion and pulling back offense-oriented assets from waters here. China would also provide China with the security and needs seeks and make efforts to deepen cooperation viable. Carrier removal, so shifts to flotilla-centered strategy. Am I supposed to read this? Decreases first strike risk and improves the operational capability. Rule 110-115 was underpinned by the assumption that the carriers intended these force pushing. This assumption is invalid. There are now large areas too dangerous for carriers to operate even having a high vulnerability. Bomber systems are making skies more threatening for the airways that comprise the carriers. There's no magic shortcuts to maintenance efficiencies might be found in the margins, but time is needed for progressive iterative drills. This leaves as the only number of carriers. If 4 carriers are the only variable, there's only one conclusion. The Navy ought to conduct war of its presence operations with forces other than the carrier strike groups less obvious with the replacement of one part. One part has already been established. Smaller shift to distribute lethality and survivability. This will make life harder order for the countries that want to shift army presence by sidestepping access area threats. The Navy would become more risk power and disintegration to flotillas offers greater terror and having less chance of winning a battle at first salvo. Adversaries may be less willing to risk a first shot. It prints rapid escalation into cyber and space conflict. Kelly 13 while proponents state the strategies and focus mission carousel. The Chinese name and some proponents by now how the vulnerability needs to be shut off the U.S. which will China that could precipitate a spiraling destabilizing arms race. We should just shift towards a more survival force posture that needs to be not solved the underlying problem forces. Vulnerability in the Pacific. Each factor favors A2AD. It also has the potential to keep Chinese fears cause the Chinese to redouble their A2 efforts. Chinese regard air sea bound strike forces as threatening. These community commentators are to conquer Chinese identified efforts to respond to space and cyberspace and space speed. Depends critically on the networks and satellites that connect the sensors and CNC is accurately the military networks will be hard enough to withstand the cyber attacks. China will be able to conduct the ASP. Will reinforce China's motivations to develop means to initiate cyber war against the U.S. strategies that encourage mutual restraint rather than early offensive action may be advantageous spills up into space. Plan thinks ASAT attacks or de-escalating Example 14 China could be involved in dangerous activities such as direct descent during a crisis to show presidential hostility and could be misinterpreted and escalate the crisis. PLA publications argue that shooting down the U.S. really want to tell us we de-escalate stabilizing the naval counter China's Navy attempted to demonstrate capabilities during the major crisis to ensure potential U.S. military involvement. Space conflict goes nuclear. Villains 15 the most worrisome. Flash poison Norway military rely on satellites for warfare. Space has become the ultimate high ground as China risks of conflict against the entire planet's space infrastructure and easily ignite full-blown war on Earth. Tension around approaching fully point due to test of possibilities of weapons by China. China in particular has demonstrated the need to drill U.S. satellites to China. The U.S. is attempting diplomacy with minimal success. The FDU and the long-winded discussions stall the failure to place diplomatic solutions in limbo. The hostile actions for these satellites could easily escalate to a full nuclear exchange. Each separate satellite at risk because the rules remain unwritten. A missile soaring 3 one task sent a missile soaring 30,000 kilometers approaching geosynchronous satellites plan. The United States should reduce its carrier presence in Northeast Asia. Advantage to its slacks over naval dominance. Escalate the security dilemma over the Strait of Malacca Glacier 13 unappreciated path is. His security dilemma between China and the U.S. Chinese imports are vulnerable to the Navy. The owners for the next move flying with China. This competition has the potential to generate crisis dangerous by requiring the ability to practice slacks among key rationales for requirements. China's naval modernization leaders were still deciding whether to devote massive resources. The early stage of this dilemma already playing out. China wants to reduce use of military power. The U.S. wants to preserve its current capability. Both classes see China needs to defeat these capabilities. The U.S. reaction consists of the capabilities of targeting as such high value assets. Even China's interior, the interruption of China's trade seems obvious that the capabilities of the U.S. is pursuing low peer funding to China. Intensifying competition is a likely outcome. Perceptions of disruptions take recovery. Emerson 12 large percentage oil goods trades. The Straits of Malacca disruption could also be expected to have a market impact relative to elasticity of energy when exacerbate the impact of disruption in the institutional option in the short term position would have broad economic consequences with several economic disruptions in the large oil price spike that typical economy into a further slow down the even before the actual disruption expectations of insecurity and disruption could drive paper markets for oil war. Booty 14 of income drug with the Capital Provost Party income power the Euros in May. The air Western countries break up the U.S. economic insecurity can be seen in the influence of groups characterized by economic needism and geopolitical isolationism in Asia. Nationalism is resurgent where territorial disputes remain serious and historical grievances faster economic failure could fuel nationalist tendencies and trigger military combat. The high-rated dangerous Afghanistan and locally failed states economic failure fueling extremism and terrorism failure to France. The depression of power authoritarian regimes leading to world war. Carrier Northeast Asia key to Chinese energy security fields which are the Chinese are obsessed with U.S. carrier at the height of the United States crisis. Difficulty managing the carrier. The swelling experience still everything resolved sent by the expectation of Washington dispatch. A carrier contingency. The leaders fret about Malacca. China's dependence on seaborne energy set up speculation that the U.S. might seek to blockade the choke into this stems from the feasibility of less from the feasibility than from the belief that China's strong trust in energy security to build physical goodwill of the United States will do with our undertaking as a try to change raising wood. Play the pivotal role Chinese analysts bristle at the U.S. presumption that the country to command any ocean by China's acceptance of war included. The eroding quickly Chinese trying to see their nation enclosed by island chains. The U.S. can circle China from its strongholds where powerful expansionary forces are based openly established the Chinese imagination strong as much as Yusuka. The centerpiece of the U.S. basically Yusuka is the ideal strong land students is the is the ideal for maritime force to carrier. There is a sharp danger in the Pacific. It can control the East Asian Maritime and East Asian mainland and Malacca. Yusuka controls the 3 states of hub that like the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The authoritative PLA documents quote with the consensus that authors and highlighting PLA officers who are leading thinkers. The PLA defense planners anticipate the sizable expansion of the targets that include U.S. forward presence. Some documents suggest that Yusuka is the power target carrier groups near China's coast. Directly vexes Beijing. Analysts advocate destructive operations. The PLA would do everything it could to successfully weaken, isolate, and sink the carrier. It drives Chinese India energy competition and oscillates to war. Clemens 12 relationship with China and China become a defining feature of this strategy environment. There are several areas which may be clashing points. Energy security is of the utmost strategic importance to China and India. Competition for energy resources will only become a feature of the important aspects. These maritime control in the Indo-Pacific Oceans, the sea lines of communication acts as dialogue for both the two peoples rivalry provides great insight into their adversarial energy relationship. Two political and geo-economic interests collide. The Myanmar is an important as it provides a land where vital resources can be shipped through in place of the Strait of Malacca. The Peninsula Malacca can be blockaded by arrivals of great concern to China. The energy politics are based on geopolitical security considerations to avoid unnecessary or accidental escalation. Goes nuclear over Sami 13 China. India war tension have been increasing despite the economic relations. The border dispute appears intractable. The border could be the border war could be repeated. The militarization for both is a growing reality. Any escalation will have a direct bearing on the great disability of Asia. Nuclear armed China and India with more than 3 nuclear weapons will fight a future war. Physical proximity form with a great tragedy.
Alright, you good?
Yeah.
So the first laser card's about security dilemma over the Strait of Malacca. Strait of Malacca, obviously not in Northeast Asia. What does that have to do with the plan?
Well, but the carrier does patrols there from Northeast Asia, right?
So a carrier does patrols there from Northeast Asia, but there are other forms of military dominance where this Glazer card does not, in the highlighted or underlined portions, say carrier. So what piece of evidence?
It's about the U.S. naval dominance that's only possible with the carrier.
Could you give me a line of any piece of evidence that
Yeah.
says that naval dominance is only possible with the carrier?
Yeah, the Yoshihara Inten evidence.
What part of the Yoshihara Inten evidence is about that?
This
pretty long
evidence
card.
says, quote, Chinese leaders fret about the so-called Malacca dilemma. China's dependence on seaborne energy set off the Chinese speculation that the U.S. might seek to blockade that choke point. This insecurity stems
Okay,
lost
you
from the
haven't said the
judgments.
word carrier. I have to move
Well,
on
the
now.
card is
So
entirely
The card
about
is
the
entirely
carrier.
about the
It's
carrier.
entirely
That's the
about the
argument.
carrier. I
Yes.
guess we'll talk about that later. What about carriers is such a unique threat to China? Why does that freak them out particularly?
You want to answer this question so you get it correct?
Yeah, sure. So, carrier deployment in a crisis, at least the way our strategy currently works, is perceived as a risk based on attacks on the Chinese mainland. The carrier is the main and really only thing that can do that effectively.
Okay, so it's about attacks on the Chinese mainland. That's why it worries them.
Yeah.
Okay,
And it's also like a very large escalatory measure if it's deployed,
why is it a large and escalatory measure?
because the U.S. views it as kind of like a trump card in a crisis that shows that it's really like deploying an extremely strong capability, and we say that invites a disproportionate response from China.
What piece of evidence cites that disproportionate response, trump card, etc.?
Yeah, the piece of evidence that talks about China's naval planners incentivizing asymmetric capabilities. It's the card that's tagged. They will move to cyber and space. I can't remember.
That's a great sort of segue to my next question. What's the connection between a flotilla or a flotilla-based strategy and space?
The Ruble evidence. Well, it's the flotilla-based strategy isn't the internal link to the space impact.
Oh, could you explain what the internal link is to the space impact?
So the internal link to the space impact is the piece of Gompert and Kelly evidence, which says that proponent carrier-based strategies incentivize asymmetric responses from China.
Great. Where does this Gompert card say carrier?
Large naval
It's
surface
about the
vessels.
offense. Yeah, it's about the offensive strategy.
Okay, offensive strategy. What piece of evidence says that offensive strategy is uniquely connected to carriers?
So the Gompert and Kelly evidence is about large naval surface vessels.
Large naval
Which is
surface
the carrier.
vessels. Could you
Which is
show
the
me a
carrier.
part of the card where it says large naval surface vessel?
I'm pretty sure that's a quote.
I'm pretty sure it's not, so we'll see.
I
Okay.
can read another carrier key card from Gompert, but I should
Please.
says that.
I invite you to do that as soon as you possibly can. So what about the plan prevents the U.S. from moving a carrier into the Strait of Malacca in the face of a crisis?
Well, the U.S. doesn't have anywhere to base the carrier besides Northeast Asia.
We have other carriers that
No,
are
we don't have other ports in the Pacific that can host this.
This is
fleet.
also the only forward deployed carrier in the world right now.
One IC's been sent. 3 off.
But it's still the same now.
Yeah, 3 off. China slots.
We're not changing it because we want to be on the agenda. It's all over.
Plot twist.
One arm.
Plot twist is Wilders.
One thing I was gonna say before is wouldn't it be cool if we just stake the debate on a Smash Brothers contest?
I would lose pretty bad.
I would win. How do we handle that?
Would we be able to call in Josh though?
Maybe.
I need you.
It would be a crew battle.
Oh, I see.
We
not-
probably
that
would
is-
be a crew battle.
Yeah.
That's not fair.
There we go.
What?
Okay,
Alright.
we're
Everyone good?
What's that source?
Maybe move your chair a bit until left so I can steal your time during speech.
Yep, love it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Alright, all good? TPP will pass with PCE ring 311 6.
Home faces stuff that challenges ACA for its weighted coverage group TPP and wants to worry about whatever home is attempt to have supported previous agreements. TPP is a more present given that we're going to for TPP fast track that house will be called so almost going back to a total the charge library to ensure answer to the question is will the White House Democrats will this being a plus last week policy should there's no reason they won't plan to raise capital each or 10 gates as repeatedly knowledgeable triples are rentable with Marshall leaders not in agreement on reform and demand that their capital just be funded the security defending multi-triple president as virtually untouchable key to ag bill 1028 TPPs issues ag leader how to be worth an ag X or worth an ag X or to be very city goals of like build eliminated for Texas or products failure rates of every product over then under CP will ripple across rural America the export opportunities that every step of the production chain station liberty and state as no production region or world states go to war resource famine also red terror the US can take the leading positions that's increasing food production may play just like world survival of our planet next off is the disad ASV is creating key US credibility tree 13 nations probing strategies really well is wondering about the nation under which the US would defend their interests and key challenges how to address the from the your abandonment and territorial flows of China AOC found offers a solution signals markers all nations taking each to a strong multi-representative that's a real significant also response to eventual Russian Chinese leadership needs to calculate the potential a first strike would be issued within the US would not retaliate after the like strong a carrier the credible US leadership and Asia significantly has the expectation of allies and partners of the US would come to their defense again help with China favor to do so what Taiwan would deal with devastating blow to the US its reputation to deter credibility specifically carriers are key they're perceived force or limit Even before circle defense will military review, so we'll see the presence against alliance or conservative don't trade US global interest lie even before to be employed to several states threaten and deter forward presence produce like carrier battle versus of kind factor to ensure regional stability and achieving the international environment manner conducive to American foreign policy presence of the ships after seizing attention of leaders maintaining increasing withdrawing forces will draw attention perception of declining commitment cause wildfire full of collapses MPT Center 15 challenges assurance of circular in the notifications the critical factor is perception the potential war to be resistant growing the flood allies to seek assurances the US will continue to protect the river and continue to develop China's modernizing the gap between the US and allies become two large allies will lose face Japan or South Korea might develop nuclear arsenals which would be military credibility MPT loss of confidence would send reverberation across the entire alliance system development itself far-fetched possesses leading capability to develop likely nuclear or Cooper 15 the MPT as one of the strongest international norms they would call 190 countries will be at the table dramatic change will incremental wins like at the core of the path to complete disarmament it was it including the MPT would be those onyx success it is the norm reduce potential nuclear test across the global cooperation strong the US and Russia are fully blending started and then work under this vulnerable technical resource measure to protect against nuclear conflict lack of Asian threat triggers global nuclear war ability stability in Asia can be correlated to US left working to determine assurances and perception they tell you some of it and use dominance help stabilize this global leadership US has been able to neutralize by encircling deterring the situation would be strictly determined to make the actors able to do it as they like destabilize and waste rapid militarization across Taiwan nuclear breaks of it ship already the DCLIs Korea or all those true US as a central force in constituting stability defenses will however it appears the US commitment is in doubt next off the counterplan the United States should offer substantially expanded high-level dialogue with People's Republic of China concerning military modernization crisis management and escalation control the United States should provide the joint concepts for access to maneuvering global comments to include escalation controls including procedures for observing geographic boundaries and conflict coordinating off targets likely to cause nuclear escalation limiting attempts to cut off adversary trade flows restricting offensive cyber operations and communicating efforts at escalation limitation to adversaries the United States should reverse the defense budget cuts containing the budget control act of 2011 the United States should conduct more of its forward presence operation with smaller ships rather than carrier battle where dialogue solves escalation and maintains assurance so handling all air sea battle has come under scrutiny as aggressive the challenge is not to discard it and replace it with something more significant but to replace it with a broader security strategy that preserves stability the Chinese should try to push the force back the air sea battle seeks to use new technology to counter these air sea battles rightly emphasizes improved command and control positions trying to advance also to best role in submarine operation and the use of air and space each country attention to see the other's efforts to defend its interests threatening the air sea battle concept is sustaining credible use of security women to analyze as we continue necessary military modernization and enhance dialogue with China's military will become more important as well sober crisis management solves the risk of miscount makes deterrence credible COVID-13 if the US launched a massive potential attack aimed at taking the Chinese regime harms would appears would be justified but this is definitely not the ASV or ASV approach it focuses on conventional forces against conventional forces care must be taken one with the attention of really involving nuclear level logical steps include observing geographical boundaries coordinating conserving targets including the incredibly communicating efforts limitation efforts must be integrated plans well before the onset of conflict and the real militaries must be able to present to prepare for War II to focus on avoiding war these steps preparing for would be to make cooperation more likely by inviting China to capitalize on American election to respond to air sea battle should be encouraged and funded even as they are results in want to ensure that they do not lead us to Armageddon sequestrations the reason is failing the counterplan solves that with all working to rebalance as resources and failing the US military take the budget cuts which until the budget threatening to haul off the US Navy report as attempting to recognize its service in line with the administration pivot as sequestration is handcuffed as efforts advantage 1 ASB is not the cause of Chinese buildup, it's key to preventing Chinese involvement in Route 13. Myth. ASB based on China more likely to assess in the cover China buildup maybe long before ASB 1 can only view the limits increasing China's theory 1 is reducing the power and influences of working session 2 Chinese theory the implication is that we ban on ASB or which are less likely this is backwards ASB was so important analyze began question understanding power in the face of perception of the like the test was often so favored to pepper to 80 and the commitment to a version of confidence of the PRC with its own creative and stable degree situated in the PRC capital a more of the size increase of discount the strategy that short term interest that means to protect them as less the likely great discount ASB is a limited application power the divine limit
but it ends. It's nothing like containment. AFB is non-provocative. China knows what it's doing. Outport 15 in isolation. It says the U.S. and itself for the China long slugging match that China is in a better position to win the fear that directly lead to a nuclear war, likely while off the mark, even a Chinese-led individuals who reach the conclusion of war with the U.S. and its allies was wise. What was wise as a staple of rational hunters would shy away from the mutually destruction leaders of which said of its self-preserving principles. Common sense would dictate a version of society whose no tragic criticisms that it will and its of the war was designed to fight or nonsense or model did not trigger World War III. It provided a contingency option, no backlash. China likes U.S. presence and heat withdrawal. It was 14 with stable power greatly benefit China from the individual and stable sea lines help support China's rise on the West force move freely across lanes here to use power but do so energy and more. The rights of quicker example how China benefits from strong presence. Beijing may not consider it in its interest to admit U.S. presence if the U.S. was to relinquish Beijing would be forced to step in. This would entail significant costing on the apps. Usual skip that. No chance U.S. strike China Matsu in 14 times. Also contains space for argument, but absolutely that is completely false. ASP would be able to relinquish the murder of Russia and China doesn't have a sword to in that conflict escalate any further. The U.S. would quickly avenge China. Nothing to fear of containment and double darling 15 should. The U.S. adjust policy which like Chinese search for the which parts of the foreign not defense against missile defense. I see the U.S. be able to be anything short. A way rule would do that will change the balance. Should the U.S. will issue its size of war open posture rules, even those we do not consider. China must be part of the discussion. GMD, ASP, civil defense, and nuclear trial post from Chinese deterrence and the plan is insufficient. Tons of all causes a DoD commitment. They shift the deck chair. Steve is 12 DoD guidance committed to continuing presence of citation to establish border trust that it does not like presence directly to these interest guidance focuses on missions on permanent presence. They determine what presence is needed. Left largely regional commanders and North Europe performance hard to define the world strategy view or U.S. watcher B Southeast Asia that will put it there. About 14 ASB define to the future military agents Southeast Asia based on our naval power. And the ships will flipping move back to strike line 12 and Chinese line attaching to U.S. life force and shore requiring U.S. civil line. But there's battles to strike our ships and aircraft would move into position next to mission with a full reverse methods to use and networking. C are missiles for ASB or land based Mantle 10. Do as special strikers based on land land sea based bombers and strike fighters plus the land attack. Cruise missiles or we use bombers not on carriers Mantle 10. Air the battle will play several means. Mark the card means. Next advantage?
Yeah.
4 deployed carriers, key to header and self-power. Parker 13, the most strategic use of naval power event. And aircraft carriers are one of powder that shows that with the carrier can do its self-power protection mode to be a way to suffer utility. The carrier voting on myself. And hard power producing smart power is no one match any other platform in existence. Cast and Uber system presence power protection. And CSC as a Lily pad muscle ship water generation campaign comparable strategic mediation on the platform over these guys. Little ship can, but there is a large line timeline with the activation and arrival wars UI orders on 13 November, which meant to face their best case arrival early December. Carrier based standard key to self-power disease bound to receive failed state allied assurance of refugees by 13. The so high on in the Philippines and Enterprise of the U.S. short of Washington left for delivery of over 600 plus metal waves, so natural deserts, and inventory emergency more common U.S. will be facing the U.S. this weekend and fragile states with the inadequate health services over to the vulnerable tourist laws as usually moving cosmic money during immediate post-disaster rates against our larger teaching imperative as after relief self-power sends a messages global force for goodness and of the underestimate when the U.S. is perceived existing influence to China to escalate and contain disasters, spreading us when the world crises can easily spill over in the form of massive refugee flows, spread of diseases or environmental collapse. Mark the card there, extinction line on London despite more technical challenges to build through countries in the rise of China and Brazil and other naval players in the international scene. The U.S. as well as an unrivaled terrorism, probe financial stability, pandemic disease, massive Russia security. The U.S. is still the initial nation, self-power is crucial to staying invest leveraging. This role as a catalyst perception of U.S. efforts to counter A280 is key to stop global economic collapse for Goyo. 13 U.S. strengthening Asia presence through ASB. The AFP focus on maintaining full freedom of action. This concert of the United States A280 building up forward operating base in the Asia Pacific gives U.S. less than operational capacity forces. Mainland war to 9 access military strategy is implementation for business. U.S. movement to freedom and navigation to EECs ensure stable life change and enable sources. It puts out trouble bolstering U.S. presence increasing to protect U.S. economic interests and no collapse from shocks. Cadorian 11 using corporate data set, we find that they had generally small, 25% increase in GDP, but by half of 1% higher prices are offsetting increasing external receipts. Mark the card of receipt, no econ impact, treasurer 12, and also sort of the price of lead to recover property over interest as otherwise. These almost 20 the same as upset reducing violence at plants except for the recession is literally violent. Public given severity, the proper comparison, the depression by standard the outcome looks impressive. Strong incentives for Indo-China cooperation, non conflict siler. In 14, self-interest by India and China together, economic benefits of Cold War clearly gives a real incentive to work together. India and China have been forced various however this issue. Standard for mutual self-interest. India must be aware that China's alternatives for economic nature. There was undoubtedly immediate economic nature for China and India to support each other rather than competing in zero-sum rivalry. There was enough space for development of India and China. Also, there says incentives to compete are inevitable based on ideology. Have no solve though.
You all set?
Yeah.
Okay, so your Forrester card was cut in the middle of a paragraph, and after it's cut, it says, quote, signaling by Navy forces is said to be prone to misperception and can lead to very different interpretations about reasons and intentions. The advantage of observing events from a distance may also worsen the situation, and potential enemies could fear intervention. So what's the link to this? Is that
the link is that those are things that can spur miscalculation, but the conclusive part of Forrester indicates that naval forces are the principal military arm of U.S.
Well,
diplomacy, and
so-
the part that you have read
yeah,
is
Michael-
not about Allied assurance.
Michael, the end
it's
of this
about
paragraph,
operational
the end of this paragraph, which again you cut in the middle, says, thus, some argue forward presence puts a strain on the forces, while others argue that because of forward presence, the Navy is able to demonstrate U.S. national interests. So he's citing two sides of an argument. Why do you think Forrester?
We find the
or
first one is more credible because it speaks to the perception of allies, and
Okay,
that middle of
so
the paragraph thing
the
was
first
obviously
part of the card
unintentional.
that you cut in the middle of the
Apologize for any of
paragraph.
that.
Cool.
But the part
the
that you read
Schreer-
also doesn't talk about allied
The
perception,
Schreer
which is what the
evidence,
dissad is
the
about.
Schreer evidence says
Uh-huh.
that allies like U.S. ASB, it's written in 2013 when ASB was announced, but before it became operationalized. How does it take into consideration recent offensive actions that ASB has been involved in?
Or I don't know why those offensive operations would undermine Allied assurance of ASB. Our evidence says that because it is a bellwether of U.S. commitment to Taiwan and defending territorial claims, something that ASB consistently, and specifically carrier-based elements of ASB, have consistently been
Okay.
cast as and acted in that mission towards that mission since ASB was announced, demonstrates that the perception is still the same.
Who besides Japan and South Korea prolifes?
Where Japan and South Korea proliferating would set off a wildfire effect because it collapses the
So-
NPT architecture.
Okay, so in order to win that, your only internal link to widespread proliferation is collapse of the NPT. It's not like regional prolif post Japan Korea prolif.
Or it's both.
What piece of evidence do you think you have that says that any country besides Japan and South Korea and North
But the
Asia
Cooper evidence
proliferate?
says that each instance of a new nuclear state amplifies the risk of crisis escalation, which Japan and South Korea would qualify as.
Your
The piece
Cooper
of
evidence
evidence
is
right
about
above
the
that
NPT and doesn't
indicates
highlight the word Japan or South Korea.
Hmm?
Your
it
Cooper
speaks to the
evidence is about
structural
NPT.
propensity of proliferation to heighten bellicosity of actors and guarantee miscalculation. The Santoro evidence says that
Okay.
the potential for war and nuclear use is growing
Cool.
as a result of that
yeah, so
proliferation, which is
Just quick
directly
question with my
confined
last
to
20
Asia.
seconds.
Uh-huh.
What are the net benefits to the counterplan?
Mimi?
Like, is politics a net benefit, basically, is my question.
Yeah.
And can you pick individual planks?
Yeah.
And so then the counterplan's conditional?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Is everyone good? U.S. carrier presence in Asia overinvests the U.S. in an offensive strike strategy that leads to preemption and nuclear escalation and crisis because of a fear of strike on the Chinese mainland, which they don't have any defense to group. Their ASB not escalatory arguments. We agree that broad doctrine by itself does not cause conflict. It's only the presence of the large naval capabilities that proves that there's no impact to all their little alt causes, but there is an impact to the app based on the carriers we remove that also takes out their desettling because we don't collapse broader U.S. doctrine. None of their evidence assumes the signal of the app, which is a major change in offensive strategy, which is much more restrained post-plan deterrent posture. Post-plan is better. It relies on more diverse capabilities, which ensures we can respond quickly in crises. That is the conceded Rubel evidence for posturing. Strike forces harmonizes ASB doctrine and decreases escalation risk. Number 13. This would reduce tensions about the four crisis felt on the need to attack first. It would permit then you have never time to crisis U.S. posture that is geared towards defeating international aggressions like to likely to fear, distrust, and temptation to get one that defects on the depends on turning the outside commodity should emphasize what produces without raising the risk of escalation. Most prudent now long-term approaches to the U.S. to adopt an ASB capabilities and induce approach from fighting regional escalation relying on dispersed forces with ASB. The U.S. and trying to make a turn also to create violence and satisfy the U.S. can counter to be devoted must strengthen not weaken stability. Their Alice evidence is just a grad student's opinion. He cites no one in China. Evidence is fantastic that China hates all of this, and their Mazarak evidence concedes that escalation could happen in a crisis. It could happen in a crisis. It just won't happen in peacetime. Containment is not containment and doesn't take out the app. Our argument is about deterrence, instability in a crisis. The broader perception of containment does not matter because it doesn't lead to preemption. DoD commitment doesn't matter if it's not linked to the carrier because that is the only capability that motivates preemption pressure, which they don't have any evidence about. No one cares about Southeast Asia. We only do exercises there, which is what there talks about. No bombers or on land alt cause. It's not the first resort and it's not immediately deployed in a crisis like the carriers. There's also a space impact because there's naval conflict spillover and lead China to attack ASATs, which leads to war. The other advantage. Amphibious capabilities solves their HADR dysabically and 12. The U.S. uses amphibious search because HADR for equivalent and the hospital facility make them excellent candidates for HADR and the HADR, so the surface is not possible for a carrier big and fits up to have the advantage. The enhanced capability makes them better candidates for these missions. Their evidence is about crisis responses in the Philippines. If absolutely necessary, the carrier could go there for a humanitarian response because it's not in Northeast Asia post-plan, but that all of the disasters references talk about are in Southeast Asia, which means that post-plan we solve, but the carrier isn't based there, so it doesn't take out the case. The carrier isn't key to rapid response quickly. And 12, the U.S. calls on carriers who can take care of the limitations, but open or affect the ability of the carrier to control the Eureka. And then the chain of what else required to lane the response rate is therefore limited. There is a huge resource trade-off between the carrier and everything else. 115. The carrier serves as the most carrier form, serve on serve with nation citizens don't have paper ship to hand out water freedom, like I say. It costs us 350 new public tools. The carrier that a president of a county that no chance the carrier being in Japan is key to all these things. There's no capability level reason why this is key. It's just a soft power argument that will not prevent failed states or disasters. There no card says that the app decreases the ability enough to make any of these things lead to extinction. Their impact card doesn't really impact anything at all. Haters effect on short-lived on soft powers arbitrary Forrester 13 Forrester 13 perception in the perception as well, and the potential negative effects cannot be overlooked or changed. Never received trigger may cause even bigger health problems. The attempt to gain person a mind backfire and realistic expectation can trigger dissatisfaction with U.S. advertising. Consideration might turn again trust into the member states. A business entity usually problem against the carrier sees that the government's able to provide after the ship departed this non-vital legitimacy. Self-power fails stressor and a lot of the administration of them are urgent bleeding. Everything said when the American with U.S. left for standing with rebound with this and now translated to reasonable place in soft-power burning did not get any use of soft-power could not accomplish much of fighting rate powers and not using those parts of the U.S. Alice Almighty as government shifting burden. The strategy was perceived as promoting U.S. interests. Yes, economic conflict. There doesn't assume oil shocks, which is a result of the potential for the carrier to blockade when it's based in Japan. And then based in Japan, there is no incentive for cooperation. Energy fear means that it breaks interdependence linkages, which is a warrant in their evidence that that war escalates because of escalating modernization. No ideology argument doesn't make sense if it's not tied to military capability.
ASB doesn't solve the economy.
ASB doesn't solve the economy. That doesn't make any sense. Our evidence is about energy and security. Counterpoint. Permutation do both. Permutation do the plan and all combinations of counterplan planks. The counterplan fails China judges U.S. based on capabilities, not public strategy. Presence of base and the presence of offensive strike assets assures escalation of Hitchcock 13. ASB represents the Canada set of capabilities for crisis rises. Those postures with escalating tensions. The economic business strategy gives advantage of the first move. The will have an offensive capabilities and resulting vulnerability. That's been incentive vulnerability there. Arsenals of the U.S. is not threatened to strike against Chinese targets. And ASB multi-plan show changes about the capabilities rather than offensive. That's their stated strategy. The U.S. has capability to launch a strike against Chinese strategic targets and could result in unintended escalation across the nuclear threshold. Carrier presence is uniquely threatening its potential capability
capability, telegraph threats. That means that they cancel the second advantage. It's Yoshihara conditionality. Reject a team and promote sophistry over advocacy and strategy. Students gap can never win dispo. Ensure strategic control. Don't let them kick individual planks because that would be a ton of counterplans. The counterplan does not military cooperation does not build trust, but it creates overconfidence. That makes escalation more likely. 0 and 15. Numerous barriers, plus rescue fit, and even if trust to be established barriers still exist and be operational value, personal relationship, and metaphorical is right. The strength of that relationship would likely be on the highway likely to bound into the institutional modesty. Majority of interviews fundamentally that trust. Their counterparts continue to engage on the premise of misunderstanding what engagement can achieve is could carry major consequences because the U.S. can assistantly irritate the relationship with the counterpart trying to use military relations as it needs for conducting counter and diplomacy. DoD adopted in this place states that the military primary means to de-escalate future crisis policymaking should be unsuccessful at quickly or effectively resolving crises. The plan is key to effective confidence building. Aggressive posture means they fail now because the U.S. doesn't appear to have any buying. That's a swing up in strategic differences kill confidence building. The Gawa in Korea on 14 in order to compensate for lack of activity Japan and South Korea and then trying for regular dialogue Japan and the U.S. Insists on transparency drives derived from the difference in strategy others. Look seriously at the level of trust and between Japan and the U.S. alliance and China. The PLA sees the trust requirement for transparency. This requires unfathomable time and energy to combat differences in culprit for them for the prevalent asymmetric nature of the military to military context. Since dialogue fails, lacking 11. Talks are going out where each side expresses frustration and public at two sides talking against each other like chickens talking with duck Chinese counterparts resent this diversion they see U.S. incredulity is way to affect and no way to deflect attention U.S. participants down to be respected when they respect individuals not to truthfully difficult for Chinese analysts to appreciate the way in which country has an overwhelming superiority is unable to make basic commitments. Nothing about their crisis response is credible. That's Hattigan 14. Pillsbury discussing the elections U.S. can take out. Although policymakers go pursue assurance they should not expect actions to result in good competition. Assurances are unlikely to be persuasive. Assurances can change change rapidly during crisis when they would be most valuable. Reassurance would regarding sea lines will hold a little weight their flank about the budget and small ships doesn't solve. We say that small ships can fill and not that they solve escalation if there is still a carrier. Dissent. The F does not collapse ASB doctrine read posture capabilities in a way that is less escalatory. That is that's when you see evidence Japan's response to the plan is extremely limited. 2015 hedge against for example cooperative engagement Japan's policy strategy of cooperative engagement was also this transfer has the same duties democratic factors down domestic factors such as physical strength and defense budget legal strength to develop domestic morality capability and aggressive Chinese military and clearly limited expectation for robust response as such change in Japanese policy will almost certainly remain attractive limited and incremental. Their carrier link does not say that it's key to nuclear deterrence. It just says that it's key to sea presence. That and the link card goes the other way. It will insert that card into the reading that lead in the process into the debate. ASB doesn't solve assurance for 15 U.S. allies in the station of liberty ASB attitude attributable in something representative of the extent to which ASB provides strategic reassurance opposed to the representing abandonment analysis question whether ASB would make a military focus and defense approximate base in JS. DF prepares overwhelmingly defensive oriented military embracing ASB replacement to expel something that can't violate most of their countries not aligned strategies toward China and toward Chinese relations. This would also likely undermine their pride in the imperative to engage Beijing operational uncertainty translates into broader strategic uncertainty with the future alliance way may be a compromise. The carrier is not key and the carrier is not key. Army presence and other capabilities mean there's still a tripwire which shows that we have skin in the game there. Their link evidence goes after 13. Most military conflicts involve lower levels of escalation. RC battle faces a tripwire problem to impose a less clear maritime environment. The issue is where red lines for arbitrary RC battles. China's match led to an damage problem that is supposed to contribute to a broader and Saudi American analysts false recognition that is from certainly and the way that Chinese analysts have interpreted RC battle is to identify her political and operational and that's versions there are problems with nuclear escalation among RC battle critical assessment that one escalation confrontation because agreement on and using nuclear weapons setting apart approx battle plays a lot of ability to achieve that mutual nuclear turn such an outcome is far from considering the ability depends on Chinese nuclear strike capability like humanity rules system are highly vulnerable to U.S. American deep American defense fight that might be perceived by the Chinese state time to degrade their nuclear deterrent. That's marked to turn political and economic costs may prove impossible to assuming and we number 14 because they hold comparatively indicative security responsibility is unlikely to put for nuclear economy public as a potential nuclear expansion would need to like the clear extremely high isolation one as public comment would require the public to collectively achieve with harder than the Constitution would need to amend the freedom nuclear principle would need to abandon self-defense war would need to acquire offensive capability self-defense war would need to earn wide federal political capital would simply be too great nuclear programs unlikely direct and surgery has obviously need to avoid conferring the public's perception of then public's perception of extreme hog no cascading pearl of white made we might find the rates of war in Asia whenever no one would be lower Japan and New Orleans not sure the Japanese capability would automatically not way for proliferation would find that their situation is profoundly ill they would feel impelled to take the step the most likely South Korea if you were inclined to them that North Korea will surrender them this course may be already unstable began Northeast Asia following proliferation effects are much less likely the dissent.
The counterplan links to the dissent.
Counterplan links to dissent because funding is unpopular. Food shortage doesn't go toward Legion 11. Empirical studies support these arguments and greater capital and productivity human capital breach. Every such that team unchangeable on the scenarios like water fusion theory with Middle East farm who's used this rhetoric kind of the various extensive databases on for show water and products and instances for elements of rhetoric that's marked to rhetoric won't pass and it takes forever also intended to after clone opposition to be assessing difficult times for public sphere as blood bombs and damage control down democrats appear hardened in their opposition powerfully U.S. farmer lobby is led and TV will secure protection for tobacco representative figures that the industry is called out giving speech out on information giving them back in opposition the Obama administration will until the lane to the 20 at 16 and then at the OACF is also the DoD so there's probably no Congress like there's a massive late Lindsay 10 11-5 Congress certainly be again to consider TPP TV does not require to help quickly congressional leaders move on TV rules kind of probably in the what the administration
Cross-text?
Yep.
I want to talk about the space scenario. The 1AC Billings evidence, right before every time that it says China, it says Russia and China. How does the app solve for Russian ASAT and space militarization?
Well, so we have an internal link argument, which is that naval conflict leads China to strike satellites. That will not happen.
Okay, sure,
in
but
the
this
status
evidence
quo.
says that in
Russia's
the
not gonna
status
do it
quo,
in the status
Russia's
either.
gearing up. Like, that is the claim
They
made by
have
your
no
evidence.
incentive
How
to
does the
strike
app
satellites.
resolve this?
They have no incentive to strike satellites.
Not Ukraine conflict, economic.
I
Tries
don't know
against
why
the US.
Ukraine would mean they need to strike U.S. satellites. You have not read a card that Ukraine's going to escalate. You haven't read a card that says that U.S. is going to try to do preemptive strikes on Russia to the extent that it would require them to do something like that. Go ahead, read cards about that. I don't think
Alright,
it's
we
relevant.
certainly will. I would like to talk about this recutting of the Schreier evidence.
Okay.
This evidence indicates that it's a tripwire. Where do you think that it says that tripwires will cause China war, instead of just some analysts believe that some tripwires may cause war?
So I think this evidence is clearly, one, a review of what a bunch of people think. So I don't think your cutting of it is conclusive. But I think it makes a very good argument that there are problems with nuclear
what line do
escalation
you
control
think
in air-sea
impacts
battle.
this? Because that seems
A
like
critical
there's been-
assumption is that it wouldn't escalate into a nuclear confrontation because agreement not to use nuclear weapons. Such thinking applies the logic of the stability and instability paradox that assumes mutual nuclear deterrence should be stable. However, such an outcome is far from certain. Nuclear stability critically depends on Chinese assumptions about nuclear strike capability. PLA command and control
Alright.
systems are highly vulnerable to U.S.
Or
arsenals.
most of this
American
is
deep strikes
a
might
lot of
be
this is after
perceived-
you have marked the card, but if it's
No,
about
it's not. That was all before I
if
marked
it's
it.
about the vulnerability of their arsenals, then because ASB primarily deals with conventional capabilities,
No,
why don't
I
things
think
like
that's just false.
PGS, U.S. first
We
strike
haven't
advancement,
deployed
overwhelming
PGS.
nuclear superiority?
So I'll answer all these. Haven't deployed PGS. Not going to have it for a while. 2, ASB is about nuclear also. 3, carrier risk perception of first strike risk because it's a thing we'd use. You haven't read a card saying otherwise. 4, I don't remember what the 4th thing was, but
Alright, that's fine. The newest evidence is from June 2014.
didn't read it.
Oh, that is awkward then. The Bitzinger card right before this just indicates that writ large, allies have not fully embraced interoperability with ASB.
I think it makes a more
Where do you-
nuanced argument that says embracing ASB would place them too explicitly in the U.S. camp and force them to accept capabilities that are too offensive to fit their postures and makes them very scared about the
Wait,
relations
so-
with China.
So Shinzo Abe is afraid of taking an offensive posture?
He's afraid of having preemptive strike assets in Japan. He's not afraid of, for example, increasing ballistic missile
Where do you
defense
think that this
cooperation.
speaks to like a quote or a statement from any Japanese leader instead of just some random speculation?
I think it's like someone who's pretty qualified that's quoting DoD assessments.
Oh.
Yeah, well, don't know if you want to write that behind you. Sure. The order is the counterplan, the politics DA, the like the China advantage, and then the Slacks advantage.
Whatever happened to the elevating table?
This is the elevating table, but
Oh. Is it?
I need to make it shorter than it's going to go. Okay. Pretty good. Still getting over my Harvard cold.
I'm only going for the flotilla plank, which solves the entirety of the case. It stops using carriers for day-to-day operations. I forget the exact wording of the plank, but it is a quote from the Rubel evidence, which means that it necessarily is able to solve. It shifts away from carriers for everyday operations, instead uses these small flotillas, which is sufficient to resolve the miscalculate because independently it prevents carriers from getting involved in crises, which prevents the type of unnecessary escalation they are talking about. Case proves that carriers are not the type of long-range strike business, and these are the only two warrants for why there's escalatory pressure in the status quo. Now, conditionality versus offense, critical thinking, reacting to multiple attacks increases the ability to evaluate best arguments. Collapsing teaches the negative to make strategic and reactive decisions. Second is negative flexibility. The app gets to parametricize the resolution by picking one example. It's an inherent advantage because they know more about their one app, and the negative must be prepared for every app. Now, as defense, it's not infinitely regressive. Time and quality of arguments create a limit, and also we did not read a counterplan that included any part of the plan, which means that they should be forced to defend their internal link. Second is ground. The app can always make app key arguments and add-ons, which is offense against all counterplans. Third is time and strategy score. Now, the alternative is multiple key arguments and dissets require just as many answers. Counterplans are not uniquely complex. Perms check the advantages of neg fiat, and next is to vote app. You have to believe the debate has been irreparably damaged by conditionality. Might make debate hard but not impossible. I will concede that China considers capabilities rather than our posture, which takes out the entirety of the app. This piece of evidence lists stealth bombers and several other things that are a part of air-sea battle posture, which means that the app does not get rid of those. Obviously cannot solve Chinese perception of politics. They really seriously dropped the ball here. Food impact causes massive escalation in the short term. Only production of enough food is able to create the structural ability for human life to continue on Earth. Also causes massive escalatory war, shorter time frame than the plan. Also, many more actors and potential for miscalculation. Unlike the relatively stable relationship between the U.S. and China, now food collapse causes global war. Brown 9, the biggest threat to global stability is food crisis. Transpoint to breakdown of governments collapse as possible. Food crisis places severe stress on governments and countries already teetering at the edge of chaos. The food situation continues to deteriorate. The entire nations will break down. The main threat to international security is failing state source of terrorist drugs, weapons, refugees, threatening political stability everywhere. The fall will threaten the stability of global civilization. Food shortages are coming, causes extinction. FDI, 12 conflicts, most of them be fought over like resource derivatives. World War II efforts are inspired by need to gain food to scale. In the future, be significantly greater. People are hungry. The states unstable of regions of the world were short of food. Wholesale worse than the default. Increasingly credible scenario for World War III is a festering chain of resource conflicts. The study indicates more food security and issues likely result in conflict are further Rwanda air trade. The Balkans experience wars. The UK Ministry of Defense, the CSIS, National Research Institute all identify famine as a trigger for nuclear war. Look, even if you think that the internal links this dissent is not immediately intuitive, they did not make a single answer to the thesis that TPP is necessary to cause food, to allow food aid to exist globally, which means that they cannot read a new card on this because we are not reading any extra cards. It would be necessarily too new, and we base the block strategy off of this massive screw up. Now, the uniqueness business, their uniqueness is a freeze frame. Obama's political capital gets nervous, moderates in line, and TPP passes now because of Obama's major push. Needham with 11-10. Obama's full throttle into sales push for Pacific Ring arguments like that he is convinced that Congress will ratify the agreement. Obama 10 positions to TPP arguing the deal will boost U.S. economic growth and provide more opportunities. I believe at the end, the American people will see that to win. The president said the Obama ramped up efforts to convince Congress the only warrant for delay is elections, but Clinton's opposition doesn't impact vote counts. Needham 10-9. Clinton's opposition likely to sway anyone in the Senate. Senate is Carpenter and Coons said the Democratic frontrunner's election to oppose will in fact hurt their stance and 100% the Clinton supported the Iran agreement from start to finish, yet that did not move anyone in the Senate to change their stance. My hunch is that the case with most senators. Kuhn said Clinton's opposition will not derail the deal. Democrats hate her flip-flopping. Kino 10-12 to Clinton's shameless about face on the TPP probably won't end the trade relief and the Democrats are exasperated by her cartwheels. Obama's political capital outweighs or 10-16. I doubt that Clinton's opposition will be a whole way from Congress. Again, Democrat President TPP next year. The White House established a full Congress free Congress on the merits. Fortunately, USC will finalize TPP next for the congressional review within 30 days, followed by 90 days. There was plenty of time for the Hill, even if there is delay. Political capital lays the groundwork now, which is sufficient there. Uniqueness, well, our uniqueness factors in everything that's going on in the status quo, which means that the plan is the only unexpected element. Now, they say the plan is DoD is obviously not. There is zero evidence for this to require You don't think removing a carrier or only carrier in the Pacific would not cause a massive stir? All of their arguments about redeployment necessarily take this out. Obama's the Velcro president. Agency action links to Hook and Nichols and Ted. Obama's made a Velcro to a point where I trouble anywhere assist to solve insulting the president to prove possible. And Obama's the White House chief spokesman, policy pitchman, funder, and research negotiator, no cabinet secretaries, and versus etiquette surrogate. Everything 6'10". When you position yourself as things all people, you set yourself to be blamed and maybe willing to get it outside the president. It's like now you have to believe that you can have some cabinet secretary be the face. Now it's also especially proven by his emphasis on the pivot, China bench. The circumvention business, the spin about carriers being the key threat is totally bonkers. The what you see, the Swain card is about ASB broadly triggering aggression. It demonstrates the causes overwhelm the app and also trigger it. If they are right, then China can deck our carriers with the Dongfeng 21D. Why would it possibly be viewed as a threat to them? This time, Tommy, we have a card. China is not scared of the carrier. Higginbotham and Hyman 15 threats the carrier increased aid. What is that? The Chinese forces are matched with the U.S. and improvement in Chinese capabilities would challenge the ability of U.S. commanders to gain superiority. Deterrence is a function of perception. Chinese leaders might overestimate their own military capability. Carrier rule does not remove ALC battle. First is that policymakers are locked in. They have it down. And second is that we move to Southeast Asia. The cards about how China looks at capabilities are make it sufficient. Now, the app is worse because it's uncoordinated response towards 12 without air sea battle. The Air Force and Navy would surely have tried to answer the anti-access area denial challenge through separate acquisition programs, tactics, and procedure development and organizational challenges. The result would have been a degree of competing efforts. Local cohesion. These traditional approaches will not work. Constrained budgets demand a more effective model. All of their arguments about how they do not actually change the way that air sea battle works. They are just a minor switch away from carriers is horseshit. None of their cards about air sea battle scaring China have the word carrier in them, which was an issue in the last debate. This time, I went back to their articles and source it. I control F. The Goppert article does not say carriers, does not say surface, does not say any of the other bullshit euphemisms they talk about. If we win these arguments, means the app does not solve either advantage. It preserves the impetus for escalation in their Goppert card, and also freaks them out about Malacca. It also doesn't solve the allies. Decide the plan still shifts away from Japan, which links to reinforcement business. Now the cross experts the ability to quote strike deep into the mainland is the internal to all of the advantages. There is obviously zero chance we would use carriers. Van Tol is a naval captain and expert on wargaming. Qualifications are uniquely important in a factual question about military capabilities. Bombers are used which are not on carriers. Toll and Van Tol and 10 air sea battle deployed separately. Separates can provide contact and targeting data. Carriers strike aircraft naturally have a role. They would likely lack the range to strike most PLA ships during the initial stages. UAVs and bombers can be fitted with the requisite system to be more maritime strikes. Bombers with their greater endurance and much larger payloads can provide more useful maritime strike role. They can form air sea battle anti-surface hunter-gatherer groups at worsted cruise. There are other ways to attack after the plan. China is still freaked out because missiles are land-based or on bombers which are not housed there. Now air sea battle means now carriers have super short strike ranges. They would never be used. The cross-ex argument the carriers are the key internally he directs us to the ruble card, which says underpinned by the assumption the carrier is the centerpiece of force production. This assumption is invalid. There are large areas too dangerous for carriers to operate. Here is a card backing this up and told and 10 carriers could easily approach within this year. The relatively short strike range of the current inventory of naval strike aircraft. The ranges of future Chinese anti-ship threats are projected to be significantly, substantially greater than the effective range of U.S. ship anti-ship weapons. Now land bases are primarily at risk from A2AD. The plan doesn't even remove the justification for air sea battle and our aggressive posture. Van Tol and 10 U.S. planners seem to take its given down contested air superiority. A2AD when able to be taken down large scale attacks. The consequences would be substantially worse in the event of a preemptive attack. The problems particularly acute for fixed targets such as land bases and facilities. Now there is no accidental war from air sea battle even in a crisis. A is regime survival. That's leaders' top priority. Rationality demands that China is as careful as possible with their nukes because they are in fact well aware of mutually assured destruction, which is empirically proven by Russia. Second is that China likes presence to keep sea lines stable. If you remove carriers, they have to police themselves, which creates an incentive against attacking. That is all poured in the Ellis card. Now air sea battle only happens when China attacks first. It's an inherently responsive strategy, which makes it structurally impossible for China to react out of nowhere. That is the Murazak card. And finally, fear of containment is inevitable. ICBMs, missile defense, other troops would have to be removed for China's fears to be assuaged, which is the Darling card. They say it's not about the containment, but that is what means that miscalculation would necessarily escalate. Now there's no escalation. Travel 15 assessments of Chinese civilian U.S. relations for optimistic strategy. See how low risk of nuclear escalation. The stakes of any U.S.-China conflict would be low. Neither say, but risk the possibility of nuclear escalation. More intense conflict did occur. China's strategies expect the U.S. conventional superiority and China's efforts use policy for finding the chef escalating nuclear threats. China's
deploying limited ambiguity around few to deter, policy to deter China U.S. from any temptation as conventional superiority. China's strategic community does not expect developments and strategic communities challenge the risk of nuclear escalation. They do not share U.S. concerns about the novel unintentional escalation posed by air-sea battle concept into the future. Now the space evidence, all of their billing stuff is about China and Russia. Every time it says China, it says Russia next to it. At worst, it's inevitable. China will use ASATs, Reynolds, and more sophisticated space programs would require testing, making cheap, difficult text until they generate debris. This means that no space power is likely to want to mount missile text. And other powers have at least the biggest threats are likely to come from countries that have the ability to attack. Now the slacks advantage, not spending a ton of time here because it is largely implicated by the circumvention debate on the first advantage there. First, the laser card does not have the word carrier underlined or highlighted. It's about broader naval U.S. power, and it freaks China out. Their best card on this is Yoshihara. It says the Chinese are obsessed with the U.S. carrier, including the facilities and bases that support its operations. Of course, the bases are sufficient to scare them. It's also about the Taiwan crisis during the fucking Clinton administration. Clearly, the Chinese improvements since then, like the Dongfeng 21D, or before that, we can base in Hawaii. Abramson and 12 Pearl Harbor has been buzzing with visits from carriers. Given recent carrier activity here in Hawaii, strategic location, one has to wonder what happens when other ships here. Pearl Harbor is close to trouble spots on the west coast. Hawaii is back in the middle of the new coast 45. The Sabres looking new to make that possible. The idea of moving carriers to touching one candidate for such a move. Big USS George Washington Lee carrier gets outside the USS based in Yokosuka also proves that they would just move. Would like a second prep. 437?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm on top of that.
They would just move.
Okay.
Which means that.
It improves our suspicion.
Yeah. Stop
Okay.
prep. We have 4:30 left. I think we have 437 prayer.
Oh, sorry.
Which
That's
means
probably my handwriting. 27 now? Alright.
sure.
It's okay if it's not, you can tell.
So, if we take your rant about U.S. won't use carrier vulnerability to be correct, why is it key to ASB?
Why is it key to ASB?
You've made a bunch of arguments that's like the U.S. isn't going to use the carrier. It's too vulnerable. Can't be deployed in a crisis.
Right.
Why is it key to ASB?
It's not.
Okay, what's the link to the other dissent?
The link is about allied perception.
Okay, so allied perception, at least as of the 1 NC, is tied to ASB. If the carrier was not key to ASB. Okay, so ASB has no relation to the debate anymore, basically.
Well, it does have a large relation in that most of your evidence is about how air-sea battle freaks the shit out of China.
So
and
your
you
like
don't change
quote
that.
unquote circumvention stuff, I don't think like any of these cards points out a particular capability that would be brought in post-plan. What do you think those are?
I don't think that they're about capabilities. I think they're about capabilities already present, which is how we are doing air-sea battle in the status quo.
So I guess
carriers.
we've read evidence that after the plan, the logical shift in strategy would be to like smaller naval ships.
Well, actually, you've read evidence that a possible shift would be to smaller naval ships.
Do you have a card that you think says a more likely shift would be to something else?
It's not a shift. We have bombers. The plan
Okay.
doesn't get rid of those. Those are what are used for deep strikes.
Okay. So which
They're
card
based
says
in
which
Korea
card says
and
bombers are used now?
The Van Toll cards.
So Van Toll, writing in 2010, is the person who is like, here's what we think ASB is. His vision was not implemented exactly as he wrote it in his original paper, where he was like, oh, here's my idea about what ASB is.
No.
All of our evidence from 5 years later says that the way we're doing ASB now relies on the carrier. Where do you think you have a recent piece of evidence
I think
that
this
says
evidence is about the
your
physical,
argument?
literal capabilities of our carriers versus our bombers. This is not, Van Toll is not like what he thinks air-sea battle would look like.
Air-sea battle, a point of departure operational concept written in 2010.
Right.
This is the paper the ASB strategy was based on. It is entirely about what he thinks it should look like.
No, it's
What
about
card
what
do you have?
possible ways we could use to target the Chinese mainland.
I agree. What card do you think you have from anything close to 2015 that says this is how we do it now?
Unless they have reinvented what the carrier does in those previous 5 years, made it invulnerable to DF-21D strikes, gotten rid of the entirety of our bombers, clipped
so
their wings.
you don't have a card that says U.S. decision makers have made this calculation.
You don't have a single card that
we
these
do, but
strikes
your
are-
entire link story to the assurance dissad is based off of the use of carriers to deter China.
It's based on the perception.
Which is what I don't understand.
Carriers
If the
have,
carrier isn't deployed in a crisis to do anything,
I'm
why
glad
is
you
it
asked
key
that.
to assurance?
I'm glad you asked that. So carriers have an admiral sitting in the front. They are the biggest ships that have ever been created. They are like a mile long. Our allies see that as a signal of U.S. commitment, just like you said in the cross-ex, because they are so big and so valuable to us. The fact that we are willing to put one in Yokosuka makes it look to
your
Japan
argument
like we
is
are
that the
support
carrier
them. We trust them
literally
that
does.
much.
Your argument is that the carrier literally does nothing in a crisis. It serves no deterrent function at all.
It does stuff for like humanitarian response.
Okay.
It does stuff for diplomacy.
Attaching the document right now. We'll do the swaps advantage and the
Are you not
allies.
taking?
Yeah, so
They're
I'm
taking prep, Michael.
Mimi, do you mind if I ask you a quick question? Did you read all 3 cards under A.T. Clinton?
Under what?
A2 Clinton.
Yes.
Okay. New cards.
That's like the
Phase 148.
Nice.
So minus 2 minutes would be 6:17 plus 12 seconds would be 6:29. God, I dropped this
Alright, just then. The order is not drastically changed.
you have to do it again.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Advantage 2 and the assurance design. You have the version of the original.
Are you reading out of the 2NC doc or
The one?
2NC doc?
No.
Okay.
Everyone good? Good. Concede no link to hate, or we can just move the carriers out from circumvention. Also concede no impact to soft power. Royal shocks don't undermine the economy. The call evidence is a statistical composite of data that indicates there is no correlation. Decline doesn't cause world outweigh crisis. Proves international organization ensures that we see that stress or no impact conflict there are overwhelming ideological and economic incentives for continued cooperation. They will cut off their nose to spite their face the dish. Prolif outweighs A magnifies all escalation risk. Every conflict becomes more deadly when each target gets a new beat bypasses checks on escalation cost preemption free for 15. Therefore, economic acquisition of the warmest like US partners stage will improve the process of for Chinese power. The Earth system company theory, we have the interval in which former allies lost protection of the American umbrella, and the point at which they acquired their own will be one in which they would be so or threats of preemptive attack because of the mistrustful like outside multiple order the organization might be especially drawn to instability independently. They can see the alliance structure, soft remilitarization. That's the go evidence. A subpoint is alliance structure sustains regional institutions which provides a cap on escalation map scenarios. B subpoint turns all provocations arguments into works because allies are untested and have ideological, historical, and disputes with China. C subpoint as it turns India. You can see it causes India packs have remilitarization, which is destabilizing that. As go SOCO prolif independently is conceded. It causes horizontal prolif and a war on Korea. Panda 15. If SOCO officer do the worst, it would not play the PD. The very path of the trigger and SOCO don't strike the series and still not be ignored. SOCO as a warning world to your power race in the event of for the nuclear South Korea would ever get the MP leaving more vulnerable to attack given the from no trigger a chain reaction in Taiwan and Japan. Korea more goes nuclear spills over globally mass 13 North Korea as most dangerous country on North American Muslim so I failed to recognize signs of impending attack and more ream with this gun. With we would repeat this we cannot know whether we said or third war the same war could be when missile strikes or attacks by the do weapons war would force military mobilization U.S. to be a body blow to government spending and full-blown deficit reduction coupled with shock global economy and FD civil sex outside over the stage the result could be how so we use the China control of nations for one to warn out the app does not shift doctrine. That was the 2NC process, but it does collapse supported signals that we will back up allies in territorial disputes. A subpoint as public perception, fear of external threats, slope calculation of versus the current machine Yoshida. 14, Japan has been going through changes in the world increased levels of threat from neighboring states. Japan has begun to adopt more aggressive policy of people's perception. From their attitudes toward nuclear armament perception to find military have boosted support for nuclear armament. These and example more implications of policy to nuclear proliferation under the assumption Japan is protected by the U.S. environment is likely. This does not mean Japan will never receive armament support. Will prolong the increasing military threat as China gets more aggressive. Japanese will be increasingly concerned. Mark their carrier presence is central to deterrence. Historical evidence that China presently to threat sea-based deterrent has been the most important component of American military watching USS George Washington. The events very important to only Washington until the there was growing concern about the threat of U.S. extended deterrence deployment of George Washington indicates America's commitment to defense of Japan and allies in the Western Pacific and India, which remain part of the carrier. Those who will continue to be important for maintenance of capabilities and preservation of security come up with Japan and the U.S. ending carrier deployment to placate China sends a signal of weakness. Chang and then decision by U.S. federal military exerts marks of legend series. Ill consider possible extension. The exercise would assume the U.S. Central Washington Bureau striker. Shades of fiction by these exerts on the U.S. to invest in the what's authority which govern U.S. to stand by allies. So principle of freedom and aviation will obviously interpret in many quarters as indicative of American decline in China's size. B sell point is Hawks they will gain power after withdrawal and cause nuclearization of 13 the far right, but like to Japan develop the nuclear romance about the mainstream really strong points of the U.S. is the best of one of all we don't change as would be a loss of optics. U.S. Coming to Japan's best any engagement Washington like hesitate to support Japan would cause enormous consideration to the Japanese right to have field take a long read for Washington obligation under the security treaty. And sorry about misciting of that one card, it won't happen again, but it's not offensive as it just summarizes other arguments that we still have links to the Bitfinger evidence about allies not wanting to participate and be interoperable with ASB US is so key to assurance that was above. Also other forces are insufficient because carrier was the central manifestation of US presence and the core of diplomacy. They have not read an impact to entrapment. It's just speculative. Other forces like Futenma and Okinawa trigger this, but it's not sufficient to solve the disadvantageous carrier central levels above known entrapment. Books 13 critics worry the US might get threatened undisturbed wars. History shows great powers into the danger of entrapment to spread themselves. It is impossible to find the clever of power during the great power into war. Alliances reduce the risk of getting involved in conflict in nature, regional agreements war designed to constrain allies that might be engaged in aggressive behavior. Bush and Joseph Wolsey clarifying the goal was to deter United moves out. Even if Japan doesn't prolif, you have dropped. South Korea will prolif, which collapses the MBT architecture. That's the one NC evidence. Anti-prolif arcs are culturally outdated and ignore internal politics. Japan is shifting towards militarization as capacity and bypassing legal trace fund 15. With the opportunity to Japan society leaving past Japan the security alliance or everything short less to non-proliferation Japan pursued nuclear weapons would upend efforts to restrict their spread. The investigation never absolutely no private marks. Prime Minister for weapons would enhance security after China's nuclear test. Out of confirmed the non-nuclear principles were nonsense. Optimists claim nuclear version of protection for Russian women's threat to nuclear breakout. Japan is increasingly ambivalent over Australia Navy as Russia gets cyber resistance to a resolution of authorized SCF to overseas operate no states outlet declared a nuclear arsenal would not necessarily violate the Constitution with Korea testing missiles and China enhancing a force in mid-contest over Russian Kaku. Another review seems inevitable. Tokyo as a growing defense industry carried from extra restriction mastery over missile tech and a processing facility capable of reducing naval training fuel 1,000 bombs. Japan could develop basic missiles in less than a year and so taking arsenal in free face with the rights as those numbers would plummet as Japan assumes a more active security role in these states will be tempted to rethink nuclear armament efforts to reduce nuclear risk regionally more widely here increasingly and Japanese perception triggers link Balkan and a Tokyo's attitude to nuclear weapons increasingly important if Japan's favors and non-proliferation regime changes to carry out security consequences for Japan and the consequences to Japan is maintain complicated relations but anyway favor deep mistrust suspicion of persist radio paranoid security environment where they create state exchange as alarm bells and the radio in the region China and the raise might perceive this as dangerous and moment to use this things to increase their military capabilities nuclear or otherwise without nukes they cause strike capabilities. Samuel 13 there is more Japan can do long makes the territory nuclear weapons break out will Japan's beyond long range strike capabilities and most likely weighted option for Japan is acquisition strike capabilities of preemptive operations. Mark the card there collapses deterrence turns the case Roberts routine capabilities will come to the extensive investments important to the alliance of higher priority configurations the region China might to deploy new capabilities that are used Japan identified would be erosion of interior environment ultimate strike action might result in escalation of it's unhelpful press the message might be in my allies are region that allies are losing confidence and resulting in increased pressure elsewhere to acquire strike capabilities. Now yes prolif impacted rapidly cascades the MDT is the only norm holding back global proliferation but absent Japan and South Korea's commitment to it will erode around running checks independently. Japan prolif causing extinction overall checks 15 is rough for the attention perception states to be the same there risk of misperception misunderstanding of translation nuclear war is going to be explained by answer risk of nuclear war because of technical malfunction misinterpreted state development educational states Northeast Asia fall under the shadow of nuclear threat prolif collapses Japan's never mind. Rip.
How much prep do you have?
6:29. Wait. Give me 1 second. What was the term? the China advantage, the slacks advantage, the counterplan, the politics is said, the trolls is said. Oh, you know what, Ezra?
Yeah.
I'm missing one thing. Sorry, I have to start that. I just looked at the top of my flow and it was block card. Don't have it. So there's 30 more seconds. I'm gonna send that out. Sometimes I leave notes in my flow that's get from Ezra. And I'm like, I'm about to start. I don't have to get from Ezra.
So you're resending that out?
Yeah.
Should we just exit out of the current one? Or? Okay.
Is that a yes?
Yeah,
I
that's
think
just.
she's.
No. It's so late. I'm just sleepy. Alright, everyone's up? For real now? Alright, okay.
All our evidence about carriers, we've read cards that say that that's the independent strike capability that freaks out China, even if there are other things that slightly harm relations or make China fearful of the U.S. None of their evidence rises to the threshold of saying that China would aggressively posture against the U.S. because of other capabilities. The AF isn't uncoordinated or swing evidence is that the natural result of the plan is a shift towards new defensive-oriented capabilities. That means that we still have some deterrence capacity and assurance in the region, but we don't aggravate China. Their Van Toll evidence is a 2010 independent paper that suggested ASB not describing it in practice. Van Toll intent that the U.S. can choice. This paper offers a point of departure context. We have intelligence concepts toward ASB. Our evidence is about how ASB has been implemented and how China has reacted. Carrier strike groups, key Gerber 13. We are restructuring the same strategies in ASB. The new narrative with the accountability of these wars here can unique challenges in the near future. ASB is intended to penetrate the defensive by using carrier strike group, which is unstoppable. How are you going to 150 kilometers of approach? Just replies as false data as costs drop. The number of countries able to stream such as they will only increase the strike-based strategy to make effective, aggressive to neutral parties and unreliable. The fifth China election use its anti-axis is dubious. Mark the piece of evidence. A dubious rule says that this is what China assumes, even if it's not true. It's just a question of Chinese perception. Even if land's capabilities are vulnerable, land's capabilities aren't what initiates conflict, which is different. The AF creates a use it or lose it mentality that incentivizes miscalc between the U.S. and China because neither knows which one has truly offensive capabilities. ASB is the linchpin of those capabilities, but it's all dependent on the carrier because that's what allows offensive strikes in the first place. Yes, escalation miscalc was above Russia doesn't have an impact, so it doesn't matter if they have ASAT potential. ASATs or not. ASAT is a question of their ASAT's evidence is not written in the world of asymmetric capabilities, which the incentive only exists for in the world of the SWO, not in 2008 when their evidence is written. The slacks advantage, the plan decreases carrier presence, which solves the internal link to their first piece of evidence. Their second card is just about how Hawaii, but Hawaii doesn't link the right piece of Yoshihara evidence. It says that the proximity of the base is key. I'm reading a piece of Fravel evidence. I think that was supposed to be on the other page. Shari, yes, escalation, Fravel 13. Although no first use remains growing ambiguity around this policy, the Chinese debate indicates the policy might not serve as a constraint and therefore no first use in the crisis. The actions might be seen as indicating preparations to launching first and launch first in a minute. It prevents the first strike. The counterplay doesn't solve the act. They drop all the cards about how Chinese perception is key, which depends on assets, not on capabilities. All that the counterplan does is it says we'll use flotillas sometimes, which proves that we use the carriers in the region. It doesn't take out the app because the internal link is all about the carriers. It still links to the disad because it decreases the use of the carrier. Now, the politics is that food shortages don't cause war. Productivity increasing and resources will always be generated. That's our Lucia, and so food scarcity July. And for the world double root for output, we have raised the supplies per person by 25%. In the third world, there is no obstacle to production meeting rising meetings demand. The global technology code the world could feed 35 billion people. Fears of shortages provided on founding developing countries. Production has grown faster than the population. All causes Myers-Briggs global food security will cause a catastrophe. Among the main sources of population growth, rising influence, urbanization, industrialization, climate change, lack of new genetic and technological breakthroughs, declining pastoral crop techniques, trade barriers, energy costs, biofuels, shortage of agriculture, food production specialists, and agricultural and aid budgets. The act also turns it because in the world of U.S.-China cooperation and resources, cooperation is impossible. There, uniqueness evidence goes negative. Even in Afghanistan, you need to review it. I've got a number of areas of concern, a number of areas where I think this is very strong agreement. I have it right, I don't think any member should be saying, oh, I'm definitely against it, I'm definitely for it, with no idea what's actually in the agreement. Facing some headwinds among progressive Democrats, Republicans, including some more concerned with the treatment of tobacco and high-end medicines of the deal. Here's another card that concludes Neg or in 1016. However, some seasoned pro-choice skeptics say that this big window of review card with TPA could be a curse within the blessing for TPP's ultimate patch of expectations for detractors from both sides claim TPP lacks meaningful rules on currency manipulation. Marks of currency manipulation. They conceded the only warrant and the only card Ezra read, which is kind of awkward for them. The last line says, quote, delaying ratification to late 2016 at the earliest, which proves that it's not even coming on the docket. It won't pass Myers 15. The PPP may not pass due to the anti-free trade petition by the last UAP support. More than 20 Republicans are holding them back from supporting without their support. The deal may not pass. We're hoping about to concern about the card proposal for tobacco without the support for the GOP members. The deal may not pass either the House. If either the House or the Senate rejects GOP, the deal will not go forward. Just a handful of Republican votes can keep it from winning a majority no vote until late in that political time going for the 10 14 TPP may not get taken up until after the election. Summer said that Democrats are unlikely to move until a lame duck session. Shriver as much of that TPP is until lame duck. McConnell raised concerns, saying it needs intense scrutiny. I don't think it's going to come up until after the lame duck. Their 2NC evidence also concedes that elections are a major barrier. There's no way to know when a vote will happen. Washington Post 11 the administration officials said if all goes smoothly, the deal could be in the hands of Congress and lawmakers, but the schedule of vote remains highly uncertain. The congressional leaders would choose to delay the process indefinitely or even until after Obama leaves office. The other dis had impact on everyone role of the F. China initiating war against U.S. breaks regional cooperation collapses. Assurance guarantees, which evidence says is largely dependent on effectiveness of assurance. No Korean War, Jackson 15, North Korea will add also say to avoid war sugar actions. Historical behavior confirms that North Korea's power goals. Regime survival. North Korea never escalated beyond total. As I said, attacks North Korea never escalates. North Korea has consistently shown between North Korea's rhetoric and social preference for not taking action over terrorism regime. There's a massive difference between the tit-for-tat violence and devastating response. Market response. Korea won't go nuclear, but the internal link is Japan anyway. Himson 13 was still reach for nuclear weapons in response to the Korean threat. It's highly unlikely the protective of Koreans who live in North-South relations were salient, pale in comparison to 40% worried about job creation. The trickle personalities has gone on record by no means. We're trying to use mainstream. Marked up piece of evidence at mainstream, and their Mashita evidence is not about the carrier. It just says that there is a constituency of proliferation now. Their Katani evidence is from 2008. Our more recent evidence is that the carrier is not the only factor in assurance guarantees because allies perceive multiple things like the security umbrella, other forces in the region, etc. Their Hawk evidence says that any indication should be sufficient to trigger the link, but when you remove the carrier for 4 months, Messiah and 14 defense policymakers in Japan are voicing concern about the whole absence of U.S. carriers from usage of water for 4 months. Not a single carrier will be deployed. Nuclearization will never happen, and even under the worst conditions. Milwaukee in 15, the government continues to affirm that the U.S. plans to manage non-dependent nuclear weapons. Study of Japan's nuclear option. The country's most conservative analysis found no measurable scenario which it isn't. Develop nuclear weapons would be in Japan's interest. Even the worst case scenario, posting a break of the U.S. alliance collapse and non-proliferation. The study concludes it's questionable if there was any value. It would likely undermine the basis of survival, and the modest changes should not raise fears that Japan might respond by withdrawing from the NPT. Their evidence says that people are thinking about it now, but it would only happen in crisis, which proves that the only scenario for proliferation is the world of the act. Their perception arguments are about a mistrust of China, which the act doesn't implicate. Deterrence turns proliferation NAD was above. There's no cascade. We read a piece of evidence that says that it's empirically disproven. There's also no NPT impact. Twice in 9-1. North Korea being a clan program was from the NPT. Non-proliferation took a backseat to other foreign policy in regard to India, Pakistan, and Israel. Non-proliferation does not help the top of his bilateral agenda with any of these countries. And no dominant theory. Wider and 12. The dominant theory has been wrong for almost 70 years since US aid have emerged that this proliferation is the slowest in history.
427. SLOC's advantage, and then the China advantage. I can give that again if highly necessary. I suspect that it isn't, though. Prolif DA, the politics DA, the counterplan. Then the politics DA, the SLOC's advantage, and the China advantage.
I had it all wrong, so I'm glad it's alive.
Really?
somehow.
Yeah, damn.
I had the counterplan politics.
Maybe I did say it back. It doesn't actually matter. Okay, everybody ready? Preemption through perception of Japanese nuclearization is an independent impact which is entirely independent of all their impact defense. Doesn't require Japan to actually get a weapon, but instead to begin discussing it seriously in the diet as a result of U.S. withdrawal, which is sufficient to trigger the impact, but causes massive regional instability because every nation in the entire Asia Pacific starts attacking Japan, attacking each other, short flight times as well as historical animosity means it escalates quickly. There are security commitments, which means it escalates nuclear war, unlike the dyadic nuclear balance between the U.S. and China, which is uniquely less likely to escalate. Our evidence all draws a distinction between a multiplicity of nuclear powers and just one independently. If Japan nuclearizes, causes cascading proliferation because every other country feels the need to protect themselves. Look, Japan is the historical aggressor in East Asia. They are the imperial power, which means that if they get weapons, everybody else will also need them to protect themselves because of historical rivalries that are still very much alive. They've conceded the cruise missile independent impact. Japan will get cruise missiles because the U.S. withdraws, which makes them more violent, causes nuclear war independently because it increases tensions and also spills off to further types of escalation. Also undermines the AF because it means that China freaks the fuck out because Japan has these cruise missiles, which increases the risk of miscalculation. Now the alliance is a fundamental cap on escalation because we are able to work with Japan to de-escalate any conflict that occurs in the East and that occurs in East Asia, which means that there is no impact in the status quo to any Chinese provocation is able to be dampened. But in the world of the plan, these escalate. Now they say the impact is inevitable. There is no impact to regional conflict unless all these countries have weapons, unless there is massive instability. We will concede that there is no Korea War and they won't nuclearize, which doesn't take out any of the Japan stuff because they're independent words, which I will get to now. Japan is incredibly on edge. They are revising their constitution to allow them to be more militarily adventurous, but they are not yet discussing nuclearization. The Hunt card is from 2015. It's the only card that assumes the current Japanese state of Japanese internal politics, which means that since they are so paranoid, the plan will tip them over the edge. The carriers are a key symbolic effect. They have not answered the argument about how admirals sit in the bow. They are necessary for diplomacy. We have had our only carrier in the entire Pacific in Japan since the end of World War II. What a sign of confidence. The plan by withdrawing that is terrible. The other cards about military exercises and how it looks like we are capitulating to China because now all the countries know that China hates our carriers. When we withdraw them, it appears as though we are weak and unwilling to defend the countries. Now they say they make this carrier gap argument. It is entirely too new. This carrier link argument was in the 1NC, which means that you should reject it because it skews the block strategy. It's also true of all their NPT, no cascade, no prolif arguments as well. It also just proves that there is a brink. We are removing our carrier. The carrier, everybody knew that the carrier was going away to get repaired and then was going back to the Asia Pacific. So the 4-month carrier gap does not trigger the dishead, but the plan is a massive signal of a lack of commitment. Now they say no prolif, the lacking card. This is about a 1995 study, which means that we post date. The only recent parts of the evidence are about Japan's leverage on U.S. nuclear posture, not the other way around. It also just about changes in hair trigger nuclear posture, not our physical presence. They've conceded the framing about how Japan is paranoid, which takes this out. They say the countries will only proliferate in crises. That's obviously ridiculous. They will proliferate before a crisis happens in order to prevent that crisis unknown because the risks of China attacking are so high, but that itself will cause massive escalation. They also concede the embedded war that Japan can proliferate in a matter of weeks because they are a latent nuclear power, which means their impact is necessarily much faster. We have had a detente with China. We may have had the opportunities for miscalculation before. It has never escalated. Japanese proliferation is a massive changeover. The status quo now, the impact defense debate. Asia is unique. Japan is an imperial power, which was above there. Our short flight times as well as a lack of command and control for new nuclear powers, which means it causes extinction. The NPT stuff is too new, and our evidence says that despite violations, the NPT overall is able to solve, but a world without it is considerably worse because there is zero check on proliferation. This has been the only check in history. Anything else, Michael?
No, that's good.
Great. Counterplan. Not going for a process competition, but the argument about how China only pays attention to capabilities, duh, takes out the AF because we still have the carrier. In fact, it is just based in Hawaii. They misunderstood the entirety of this argument. Their argument in cross-ex is that there is no other carrier in the Pacific. There is no place to base it in the Pacific, which means that China would not freak out. However, we can just move it to Hawaii, which is the likely replacement to Yokosuka. Our evidence is specific to that being physically possible, which A, triggers the SLOC's impact because it means that we can move it to Hawaii
Malacca and B still makes it look to China like we are threatening them in escalating crises. Now politics.
RF and NARAV on Hater says carriers can move super fast, so it's still viewed as a regional kind of.
Our evidence and their evidence on the Hater disad, which we conceded explicitly says that carriers move super fast, which means it's still perceived as regional. Look at Hawaii on a map, it's pretty fucking close. Politics, not going for it. Concede the impact defense, doesn't implicate, like I said. Slots. The Malacca business, I've already explained why that doesn't, why that takes out the advantage, because it proves that China is still massively afraid. Their Yoshihara evidence on this page says that it is about proximity, but there is no reason that the differential in proximity between Hawaii and Yokosuka is necessarily sufficient to calm down China when they know that we are able to move there because they know about our capabilities. They are not incredibly stupid like the AF would like us to believe. Now, we may also concede the impact. There's no war from economic decline because structural checks. There's also no India-China war because they are too cooperative, which means that there is no chance for an impact on this page. ASB, China. The DoD is fundamentally locked into an aggressive posture towards China. The Swain card, the 1AC, as well as the card that they read on the counterplan about capabilities, cite things like stealth bombers, our land bases, etc. as things that entirely freak out China. The Van Toll evidence is not about how we should do air-sea battle. It's about the physical capabilities that would enable us to do air-sea battle. It says that we have land-based and also non-sea-based strike capabilities. It says that we have bombers, which are obviously not on carriers. These are the things that would be used for the type of penetrating strike because all of the evidence concludes that China is no longer afraid of carriers, which is also the way you should frame the AF. They have conceded our piece of evidence that says China knows they can beat the carrier. All of their arguments about vulnerability take out the AF, but not the disad because Japan still perceives it as uniquely important. However, there is no evidence. There are a piece of evidence that they read in the 1AR is the closest anything comes to saying that carriers are key to strikes. It is not an exclusive claim. It just says we could use carrier strike groups, which is not sufficient, especially because the next line of the card says that they would be not effective because their ranges are too short. Their China's strike range includes the carrier. This just, at worst, it proves that we have other things we could use to strike, which means that China would still be concerned because they pay attention to capabilities. There's no reason the plan would lead to a shift to flotilla because the DoD is locked in, which is a conceded argument. At worst, China wouldn't perceive that switch.
counterplan, and the prolif said.
Just add none counterplan?
Mm-hmm.
Wait, counterplan and prolif or prolif?
Sorry, China slots counterplan prolif.
U.S. aggression based off of the carrier leads to war and reciprocal responses from China. Deployment of the carriers viewed as overly escalatory which drives preemptive pressure. R2AC swaying evidence, I think, is a very good frame for the debate and says that the only thing that leads to sufficient allied aggression is a really scary China. The only thing that leads to a really scary China and pressures towards modernization and preemption on their part is the carrier. 1AC evidence is fantastic on it. It says that naval predominance is the only thing that matters because it is the most proximate. That is what leads to the threat of a preemptive strike on the mainland. All of their evidence about the potential use of bombers does not apply. It's all from 2010. Those things are maybe deployed in the continental United States. Our evidence is about what would happen in a crisis. It is fantastic. It says that if there was instability, the U.S. would surge the carrier in because it views it as the only thing that we would be able to use to sufficiently show resolve. That overly escalates in terms of China and causes them to try to strike our carrier. All of their evidence about China being confident in their military capabilities means that they are more willing to strike the carrier. They are more willing to be preemptive, and they are more willing to strike us because they are confident that we cannot respond, which proves all of our use it or lose it argument. The 1AC evidence is fantastic on that if China feels at the same time the threat of a capability that can strike the mainland and the ability to respond and destroy it, it is the worst of both worlds. If we win that there is a war that happens in which the carrier is deployed and China hits it, that is the worst possible scenario for Allied assurance because that means the carrier is inoperable, it is rendered ineffective. We have a war that starts and it means that the U.S. was not effectively able to show any sort of deterrent measure. That's also important for time frame because all of their arguments are about capabilities that would develop over time, and I'll make that argument specifically on case defense, but the risk of a war and crisis happening first means that it is an immediate trigger for all of their impact arguments. They do not have any top-level defense to China war, which means that you know it goes nuclear, and this is the only way it leads to nuclear escalation on the part of China. Their first argument is that the DoD is locked in. They are not locked in. They do not have a piece of evidence that the shift post plan would be bad. No, the shift post plan would be bad. We have an excellent piece of 2AC Gomper evidence that says reposturing ASB capabilities decrease the incentive for first strike pressure based on large naval surface assets. The reason why bombers doesn't take it out is because they're deployed at very long range. They would not be deployed in a crisis. We have the only card that says what would be deployed in a crisis. All of their Ventul argument evidence is describing what should happen. He wrote it in 2010. It's entirely descriptive. It is not what the DoD put into practice, which means that you should privilege all of our more recent arguments. They do not have a card that says that China is not afraid of the carrier. They just have cards that say China has capabilities which could take it out. The distinction is important because they still obviously perceive fear. Their capabilities are not by any means perfect, which means that they are willing to preempt, but they are still afraid of a carrier in the status quo, which leads to all of our impact arguments. The plan definitely leads to a flotilla. Our evidence is great on this. The ship's already deployed. It's better for deterrence. It's better for all the allies because they don't like overly aggressive military capabilities. It means that we can respond in a crisis, and this stuff doesn't escalate, so we solve our link turn argument. Slux. I'm not going to go for the impacts, but I think Yoshihara is a fantastic half card. It says that the proximity of the carrier is the absolute most important thing for China. They don't care about other military capabilities. Their only response to this is that Yoshihara also talks about bases, but a port cannot first strike China. Only the carrier can do that. It's based on historical grievances, which has led to all of their modernization, which means that the app would at least be a major signal in being able to de-escalate that conflict. We can't re-intervene the carrier. The app permanently bases it somewhere. The app permanently bases it somewhere else, which means this is an impact. The counter plan. They say moving at Hawaii isn't enough. Moving at Hawaii is huge because it's really far away. We did not read a card that carriers are fast enough to get anywhere quickly. All of our evidence is in the context of the carrier moving to a crisis slower, which means that there's time to de-escalate conflict. There's time to de-escalate tension because people can talk to each other. Carrier is the first response. The only scenario for miscalculation is immediate carrier deployment and miscalculation. The prolif dissent. their preemption and that they're not going to be able to win. That they're not going to be able to win the preemption impacts. Their evidence is not good enough on this. The status quo guidelines say that preemption is illegal, which means that all of our defense about the politics of changing those guidelines will apply to this. They need to redo guidelines in order to do it. The underlying part of their evidence proves it won't happen. It said that in guidelines in 2004 when the JDA sought funds to develop long-range surface-to-missile technology, the LDP's coalition partner, the new Komiento Party, vetoed that proposal and the plan was dropped. It said that that was the height of the preemptive strike movement. The opposition party said that they were not going to do it. They don't have a card that Japan is considering it now. They don't have a card that the plan would force them to try to do it. We've read a piece of excellent 2AC Swain evidence that says that Japan's grand strategy is to be defensive. All of our defense that I'm going to talk about soon about Japanese nuclearization is a reason why the politics of that decision will not come to pass. Their preemption evidence does not come anywhere near close to saying they'd make the decision. They said the height of it was in 2004. It was rejected. It's not being reconsidered. The link debate, the only piece of evidence about the carriers from 2008 says Yakushima is perceived as having deterrence capability. That card, one, does not make the argument that carriers will hurt deterrence, even if carrier presence is good for deterrence. Second, it links to our carrier gap argument, which was months ago. If assurance has been fragile since 2008 and there was a 4-month carrier gap after the DISA that didn't trigger the link, that's definitely sufficient to disprove it. All of their arguments about why assurance was so fragile and necessary for them to win the carrier proves that removal does not lead to the nuclearization. Here, only answer is that it isn't justified. Their 1 and C link was cut out of context in the middle of the paragraph, so obviously it was. The nuclearization defense, the aft does not lead to nuclearization. The closest their evidence gets, it says that Abe thought about it. This ignores the political realities of that decision. Tatsumi and Wiener are excellent and say that it requires a massive amount of political capital, which is why none of them talk about this publicly. The economic cost of nuclearization is far too high. That means he would not be able to develop leverage against political opposition. Second is the radical right is not that powerful. The evidence says that some people are rethinking it. Kulaki says that even the people on the right think it's a bad idea. There are very, very few people who actually think that they should do that. There's no evidence that they have enough political power to do anything. He assumes the worst scenario link argument says it still doesn't matter. Their Hunt evidence is citing backroom discussions from people in 1964. This is the only internal link to all of their impacts. It's politically impossible.
disad, and that while the risk of the advantage is large, it is interacted with by the disad, and there are comparatively more cuts into the risk of your ability to resolve the crisis with China than there are cuts into the disad. I'll start with the DA. I don't think there was a 1AR answer to the cruise missile thing, which is how I think they get to a lot of regional instability arguments that you draw in China and the US. So I think they get to the same terminal impact plus a bunch of other countries fighting, which would be bad. I think that in order to beat that particular argument, your no prolif arguments would have to actually apply to their offensive strike cruise missile component, which I don't think they do. The link defense you're going for on the disad is just that some of their evidence is old. I think they're doing well at saying that the security environment in Japan right now is very paranoid about China. They have good evidence, admittedly from 08 and 2010, that the carrier is a very good symbol of U.S. commitment, and that withdrawing it would send a bad signal vis-a-vis China and the U.S.'s willingness to defend Japan from them. I think that the carrier gap argument was new in the 1AR, and I'm not particularly persuaded that it was justified. I think they read a carrier link in the 1NC that was like bad, but I don't think that that means you get an entirely new link uniqueness argument in the 1AR. So given that, I think that the link defense is quite minimal, and that there's a scenario that was not responded to. I think that there is a risk of the prolif stuff, which gives them more of an external impact than I think the app is going for on China, given that they have the cruise missile thing to interact with your impact, and you're not really interacting with global prolif. Other than to say that like China destroying the carrier in a crisis would hurt assurance. So I think that I am pretty certain that you would result in Japan changing its posture in a very threatening manner. I'm not certain that you would actually resolve a crisis with China. I do think you have some very good evidence from Swain and Yoshihara that the carrier and moving it out of the region would resolve some of China's fears. I am not necessarily persuaded that you resolve all of them necessarily, given the debating on these issues as it's been throughout the round. I think the 1AC cross-X is like China is ultimately concerned about strikes on the mainland. And then there's a big connection in the 2AC on like capabilities or how China judges whether this is the thing. And I think the NEG is doing very well at identifying other capabilities that the United States has that will induce that fear. And while you're probably right about their Van Toll evidence being like speculative about how ASB could be implemented, I think that if China is just paranoid about our capabilities, then they will still have some latent fears about other stuff we could do to strike the mainland. And I think the negative is doing better at like connecting those explanatory dots, even though I think your Swain evidence is probably the best and most on point card about like the perception of Chinese withdrawal of that carrier from Yokosuka. So, while I do think that there is a pretty decent chance that you resolve that crisis, I'm not sure that you do, and I am more sure that there will be escalatory crises in the world of the disad.
Sure.
So I guess my understanding of the way the disad link works is it kind of like relies on this first like 1NR Machida card about the, you know, perception of Japanese fear about declining U.S. influence vis-a-vis China. Because like these carrier cards are just like the carrier is a symbol. It doesn't go so far as to say Japan cares. They're like true link cards are like perception of decline and U.S. not being able to deter effectively triggers nuclearization. Do you think that's
mean, the link story, yes, it is like Japan has worries about China and the ability to deter it, and then they have evidence which says that Japan sees the carrier as a symbol of the U.S.'s commitment to do that.
I guess my only thing is like the way this perception evidence reads, it seems to like set like a pretty low threshold for them perceiving a threat to nuclearize.
I think that there are some of the internal link to Prolif cards set a very low threshold, which asks for thumpers that I don't think the app.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, I guess my question is like why the China aggression arguments based off of like the Swain evidence that like they will aggress based on aggressive U.S. naval capability aren't sufficient to trigger that.
The argument the NEG is going for is just that they need to be assured that the U.S. will defend them, and the carrier is the symbol of that commitment to their defense.
So this might just be a difference in interpretation, but I never really got the articulation that like the carrier is key to all China perception. I got like the carrier is symbolic, but that any threat from China can powerfully change attitudes if it shows that the U.S. is relatively declining.
The relative decline that would occur is the plan, not anything endemic to the status quo. You are correct that Chinese aggression might be like increasing, but we have the carrier there to tell Japan that like we're defending it from all of that. Right?
Sure.
I don't think you had thumpers or uniqueness arguments.
That's
there.
Yeah. How do you think we should make this like bomber's answer more persuasive for you?
I think that the thing that ended up hurting you the most by the 2AR was sort of the framing that China is paranoid about capabilities in the abstract, whereas I think what you really want with your evidence set is to start the carrier key connection in the 2AC and saying that like it is the physical presence of it in Japan that causes all crises to be perceived as escalating, even if the U.S. does not mean to do so.
Yeah.
So I think that you made an overbroad connection on what China was worried about earlier in the debate, which let the NEG spin some evidence that was probably not quite as good as being more relevant than it maybe should have been.
Yeah, makes sense.
Thank you.